After almost 4 decades of inflation tranquility, we have begun to see an inflation resurgence over the past year. Price sticker shock is now a part of everyday life, whether going to the gas station, buying a new or used vehicle, buying a home, or just going to the grocery store. In March 2022, consumer prices, as measured by the U.S. Consumer Price Index, rose 8.5% annually. If that is sustained, the purchasing power of money would fall 50% in less than 9 years. The Producer Price Index went up 11.2% annually. Before going into statistical detail, I want to recognize the St. Louis Federal Reserve's FRED data system. For most of this presentation, I use their database and graphing systems. In this graph, the blue line represents annual wage growth, and the red line represents inflation. Up until last year, wage increases were higher than inflation. There is a slight aberration during the COVID recession because a majority of layoffs were imposed on low-income workers, and the high-paid workers remained on the payrolls, driving up the average wage. But since February 2021, inflation growth has exceeded wage growth. As a result, many workers have lost purchasing power despite getting paid more. This is not your father's inflation of the 1970s. First, it affects different products. And in the case of housing and in healthcare, it could be vastly undermeasured, especially for low-income individuals. Second, its causes are different from the 1970s inflation. Third, while many are looking to the Federal Reserve to control this inflation, they have far less control than in the 1970s. Finally, a new set of supply problems that were not the result of monetary policy need to be addressed to get this inflation under control. Not every product experiences the same rate of inflation. In the next 3 graphs, the overall average inflation rate is compared to various goods and services. The blue line will always represent the overall average inflation rate. The legend below in the graph associates the line color with a specific item. When looking at these charts, I suggest looking at the legend first. The first chart compares the average all items inflation rate to food as a general category, which is the orange line, and specifically to beef and veal prices, the gray line. During the beginning of the pandemic, food price growth increased and has recently followed the average inflation rate. Beef and veal have always been erratic, but in 2020, it was the first time that beef and veal inflation was 2.5 times the overall inflation rate. In this graph, I bring up measurement issues. From April 2020 to July 2020, the published averaged all items inflation rate was less than 1%. But I suspect that this is downwardly biased and that the true inflation rate was a lot higher. The major reason for this bias is that the CPI reflects the cost of a synthetic basket of market goods and services. It is this basket that weights the prices for each good and service in the index. For example, we don't want paper clips getting the same weight as electricity utility because average electricity expenditures are far greater than paper clip expenditures. The fixed market basket of goods and services are derived from a consumer expenditure survey, but there is a lag. So the inflation between April 2020 and July 2020 were weighted by expenditures made between 2017 and 2018. Now, during April 2020 and July 2020, airline ticket prices plummeted because extremely few people were flying than in 2017 and 2018. This made the CPI inflation downwardly biased because airline price drop was overweighted, because it was 2017 and 2018 airline spending that was used as the weight, and it was far greater than the 2020 airline spending. Likewise, from April 2020 to July 2020, people stayed home and spent a larger fraction of their income on food. So the almost 5% in food inflation was underweighted during this period as well. CPI inflation is called plutocratic because the synthetic market basket is based on the expenditures for each item in the basket. Since wealthier individuals spend more than poorer ones, they get a higher weight. This chart compares the overall inflation rate for various transportation items. Again, looking at the legend, the blue line is the overall CPI inflation rate. The new vehicle inflation rate is the orange line, the used vehicle inflation rate is the gray, and gasoline is the yellow line. The 1970s never experienced this kind of used vehicle inflation. Gasoline is another volatile item. The drastic gasoline price drop between April 2020 and July 2020 was not widely enjoyed since many people were still staying home and not using their cars and trucks. Again, this made the CPI inflation rate understated. Finally, this last chart compares overall inflation, the blue line, with all services, the yellow line, college tuition, the orange line, and medical services, the gray line. In the 1970s, service inflation, tuition inflation, and medical inflation were usually higher than overall inflation. Yet the reverse is true in 2021. I suspect that the reported tuition and medical inflation are both understated. Over the past 2 years, the switch to online and off-campus teaching, the quality of a typical college education has dropped. Certainly, there has been less opportunities to collaborate with various students. Many college plans were disrupted. Certainly, college students are getting a lot less for every dollar spent on their tuition. The college tuition inflation rate has not been adjusted for this quality decrease. Medical care is far more problematic. There are no market prices for medical care. Instead, reimbursements are government control for Medicare and Medicaid recipients, and the reimbursements for private payers are secretly negotiated once a year. The public insurance programs are always trying to make reimbursements unusually low, which induces a shortage of services. As a result, there are no observable prices that one can use to compute medical inflation. Providers most often give a fictitious reimbursement called the charge master that most payers do not pay. To make matters more complicated, reimbursement is increasingly done on a capitated basis, where the provider is reimbursed on an entire bundle of goods and services used to treat a disease for a particular patient. While this provides strong incentives for cost control, it also incentivizes the assembly of the lowest quality bundle of goods and services. The recent 2.9% reported medical inflation is probably below the true medical inflation rate, since reported medical inflation has not been adjusted for this loss in medical quality. The biggest measurement challenge is the measure of housing inflation. Reported housing inflation is calculated using an owner's equivalent rent. Here, the federal government is not trying to measure house prices, but instead price the flow of the services provided by housing. So, owner-occupied housing inflation is imputed with the use of rent prices. But this chart shows that housing prices, represented by the blue line or the Case-Shiller Price Index, has grown far more rapidly than the reported CPI housing inflation. A house is an asset, not a consumer good, and the CPI does not measure asset prices. The CPI housing inflation rate drastically understates the suffering that a first-time homebuyer is experiencing. The Federal Reserve has a dual mandate to keep inflation controlled and the economy at full employment. A famous economist once said, "Inflation is caused by too much money chasing too few goods." Since the Federal Reserve controls monetary aggregates through open market operations, people look to the Fed to control inflation. I argue that this is a bad idea in this day and age. Yes, there was a time in the very early 1980s that monetary policy did effectively get us out of the 1970 inflation crisis, under the leadership of then Federal Reserve Chair Paul Volcker. But things have changed since then. First, the Fed no longer targets monetary aggregates, but instead targets a particular interest rate, the federal funds rate, which is the interest that banks charge each other for overnight loans. Second, in the past decade, the Federal Reserve has started paying interest on excess reserves that has curtailed the rise in loans that used to fuel consumer inflation. We can see evidence that the Fed has little control over inflation from 2010 to 2019, when the Fed failed to maintain its 2% target inflation rate. If they could not control inflation then, why can they do it now? Quantitative easing and lowering the federal funds rate no longer generates consumer inflation. Rather, it creates asset price inflation. And people might like asset price inflation when they see the value of their homes and their 401ks go up. But asset price inflation can have very destructive effects. It creates a wider wealth divide, it misprices risk, and it misallocates investment. This chart shows that before 1982, monetary aggregates and inflation tracked each other. But they began to diverge after 1982, when the target to federal funds rate became the policy. In this chart, the blue line shows consumer inflation growth. The red line represents monetary growth. The purple line represents home price growth. And the green line is S&P 500 growth. This should give evidence that monetary policy has done little to affect consumer inflation, but it has fueled both home and stock price growth. Here I use basic demand-supply analysis. Let's say these supply and demand lines, labeled original, represent the pre-COVID-19 economy, maybe late 2019 or early 2020 before February. When COVID hit, demand contracted as people were laid off. The supply side also contracted as many firms curtailed their operations. The supply side effects slightly offset the demand effects, and prices had a small increase. When the various stimulus payments were dispersed, the demand line shifted out, which created more inflation. To top that off, the additional bottlenecks and the Ukraine war induced another contraction in supply, making prices rise further. None of this was induced by monetary policy. This is not the case of too much money chasing too few goods. If low inflation and a strong economy are desired, the supply side needs to improve. Chip shortages, material shortages, and empty store shelves can only abate if our labor force is better skilled, and the millions of millennials who are not in the labor force get back into the labor force, the supply of rare earth materials improves, and a new trade peace emerges where the U.S. doesn't always have to sustain a trade deficit. If the Fed tightens, be prepared for a fall in asset prices. I don't know if we have reached the peak. I think forecasting inflation is a fool's errand. We could get lucky, and inflation might fall, with self-imposed supply-side corrections. But I wouldn't bank on it. Thank you for joining me.